Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Arianna Campbell. Hi, Arianna. Thank you for being on the podcast today.
Hello, Jon. Glad to be here.
Arianna is a shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting and specializes, among other things, in process and leadership. And the episode today is going to be about a huge topic that really encompasses not just those two areas, but firms as a whole, and that is shifting from change management to change leadership. So from change management to change leadership. So Arianna, why is it important for firms to understand this shift, and maybe actually take a couple minutes to explain what change management is versus change leadership?
Yeah, so the thought process has really been a big one from conversations with firms that we've been working with. So we know that there's been a lot of change that has happened over the past year, and it seems like the pace of change has just been speeding up more and more as a result of that. And it's only going to continue to do so, even more so than it has been in the past. So we had to change. There were changes made to technology. There were changes made to our processes. There were changes made to how our people are working. So there's a lot more remote working. There's a lot more blended working. Things that we thought were going to take years and years to happen just got, fast tracked. But what's happening, and the pain points from talking to firms that I'm hearing over and over again, is how can we manage all this change? And it really, those tones or those conversations around change management tend to be so much more reactive, like this change happened, now what do we do? Instead of really being proactive and leading the change and really anticipating what's going to happen and taking the lead on it. I think another thing with change management is that it is more based around really reacting to what's going wrong instead of how can we set ourselves up for success when it comes to change. And I think that's where firms are in a lot of cases falling down, is because they're getting bogged down with trying to manage the change instead of getting ahead of it and leading it.
Well, and it's so interesting too, Arianna, because one thing this last year has taught us is we are much more capable of changing rapidly than maybe we give ourselves credit. Okay. Because you mentioned, how this has accelerated the change, and it has proven to a lot of people, things like, I never thought our firm could figure out how to have remote working relationships or remote working arrangements. And now look at us. Now we're figuring out how to make this long term. And it was, overall pretty successful, even though there's some challenges in there. And so I think this topic is extremely relevant. Talk to us about some tips or recommendations for firms in terms of how they more embrace the change leadership side of things and not just the management side of things.
Well, it really starts with a mindset. I think from what I've been seeing in firms is the realization that it's not just about training on how to use the new technology. It's not just about saying these are the changes that are made and here's what we're going to do. The mindset is really beginning further back and really addressing the people side of change instead of just the technical side of change. In fact, that's the most important part, is the people side of change. And I really see firms skipping over that part and just focusing on the here's what we're going to do, here's what's changed, and not really answering the why behind the change, not addressing what's in it for the people who have to change. And while training is an important part of it, really focusing on clarification and explanation in that training and making sure that there's understanding, not that you're just talking at people, but that they're truly understanding what it is that they have to do, the why behind it, and what's in it for them. And it can seem like you have to go slow in order to do that. But what that really allows you to do is to get people on board with that change. And that's really taking it from a leadership perspective, is considering the people side of it. Because when it comes down to it, change is about feeling and emotion. When I'm working with firms, I talk to them about, how change is all about the F word. And that F word is feelings. And we don't like to talk about that a lot within the profession, within our firms. But when it comes down to it, that's what change is about feelings. It's the same for you and I, John. Like it's the truth for everyone. When it comes to change, we want to understand why we have to do it. What are we going to get out of it? We want to make sure that we have clarity around how we now are supposed to do things differently in a way that we can understand. And we also want to be checked in with to make sure, that we're really keeping up with the changes that are happening. So one of the best things to do is to really focus on the people side of change. The best way to do that, again, just to summarize, is really answering those why questions, making sure that people understand what's in it for them, and making sure that you're going beyond training to actual understanding, and really making sure that there's a dialogue happening there instead of just training at people, making sure that there's actually understanding.
That's great, Arianna. And while what you're talking about is much bigger than just what has happened over the last year, one thing that I think is true, it has made a lot of leaders more human centric in their approach. I mean, we talk about how this pandemic has moved us forward from a technology or process or in some ways growth perspective, but I feel like it has also accelerated us to be more human centric in terms of how we are leading our teams, and the things that we used to maybe not spend enough time on, we're starting to spend more time on that. You mentioned checking in, how are people feeling? Are they burnt out? What's their energy level like? All these things that, you know, a lot of people in our profession have just not spent a lot of time on before, therefore have been ill-equipped to lead in that way. Anything you would, add to that, Arianna?
Well, I think that you have to balance that human side of change with succumbing to feelings or complaints of change fatigue. So it's a really delicate balance because change fatigue is a real thing. However, we also need to lead our people through change fatigue because we cannot afford to stop changing. There is no pause on change. There wasn't before, there certainly isn't now. So when it comes to change fatigue, a lot of times why that change fatigue is happening is because you aren't leading change, you're managing change. And so we don't want to say, oh my goodness, my people, we've had so much change lately. My people just can't handle more change. It's leadership's responsibility to lead people through that change, to lead the organization through that change effectively. And if you can really focus more on the human side of change, that's how you work to address change fatigue. Things like, again, really making sure that people can understand the why of why this is happening, that they can understand what the benefits are by actually talking about success stories more than you're talking about, the things that are going wrong. Because often when it comes to change, people feel fatigued because they're constantly hearing about the challenges and the things that aren't going right. If you can spend more time focusing on what's going well and encouraging people through those success stories, that's really going to be helpful. Giving people a way to provide feedback and considering that feedback as a gift. Lots of times change fatigue happens because we don't have the proper feedback channels to allow people to constructively provide feedback, but then to also have a way to, again, get back to providing what's going really well. So again, just really, as we're thinking about that human side of change, not getting stuck in the trap of change fatigue, and instead leading through that change to minimize the change fatigue, because we can't afford to stop changing.
So Arianna, one of, where you spend a lot of your time, every week, every month, is working with really, really progressive firms that are looking to push the envelope in terms of maybe how they are operating as an organization so they can serve their clients better, so they can maybe train their team better, improve profitability, all sorts of things. And so as you have worked with these firms, share with us some of the results you've seen firms have that have really embraced leading change versus managing change?
Well, one of the biggest changes, and it's one that firms often don't expect, is a change to their culture. So we definitely see when you're leading change that there's more buy-in. So you see more successful results when it comes to, your profitability, increasing your bandwidth or your capacity, reducing the number of hours that are being worked and not really having to fight as much of an uphill battle. Those things all happen. But what I hear from firms over and over again that they really weren't expecting was the significant change to their culture. Because when you're focusing on change leadership instead of just managing change, because change management often, it seems, happens in a silo of we got to manage this project. Now we got to manage this project. Now we got to manage this project. And change leadership really takes a more holistic approach of looking at change over the entire organization and having a strategic approach to that. When you do that, it changes your culture because people don't feel like they're being pushed and pulled in every direction. Like, I work on this project and I work on this project and we're managing change different ways. Different people are managing change different ways. So when there's more alignment in that and you're really working towards the one firm approach instead of the siloed approach, it changes your culture and people actually begin to welcome the change. And I know that can sound like such a foreign idea. They welcome the change. Yes, because they know that they understand what the benefits are going to be. They are working within a framework that really allows them to successfully work through the change. And then they start looking for, well, where are other areas where we can improve? Where are other areas that we can apply this and be better? And I think most importantly, when you lead change, you involve others because you're focusing on that human element of change. So once they get involved, they don't feel like change is happening to them. They feel like they're actually part of the change and they have, influence in that.
You know, that's great. And as leaders, we often just really think about um, kind of what we're shouldering in relation to leading this change and all the work we're putting into it. And yes, we're thinking about our team being more human centric. But one thing that I've seen happen as well, Arianna, is most people in our profession have not actually experienced being a part of a project that has been led very well, that has created a lot of change, and that has been led very well. So for a lot of people, for leaders that are taking this seriously, can give their team for the first time a great experience around this is what it looks like to go through a project where we make significant improvements and it's led well. So that's fantastic, Arianna. All right. How are you seeing this topic, outside of the profession? One thing that we want to make sure we don't do, which is why on this podcast, we always talk about how is this topic, relevant to outside the profession. So if there can be any knowledge we can pull from that, we want to make sure we can. So, Arianna, where are you seeing this topic outside the profession?
Everywhere right now, right? Everyone is trying to figure out how they can change more effectively. And I think that there is a need for that, obviously, in areas even beyond the profession. But a great resource that I always like to refer to that's outside of the profession is The Change Monster by Jeannie Duck. And it is a great book that really outlines the human element of change. And the book is specific to business management organizations, but the things in there obviously apply within the profession as well. They could really apply anywhere. And really understanding what are the phases of change that people go through, really digging into that human element of change, really understanding that what are the rewards or the wins at each of those stages if you're able to lead successfully through them, but also what are some of the dangers that can happen if you don't do that effectively. And I think that no matter what what profession you're in, what industry you're in, being able to lead change effectively as opposed to just manage it should be top of mind. I mean, kind of even think about it just in the name of it. Do you want to, as a leader, and remember, we're all leaders, no matter what your title is. Do you want to show up and have to, I have to manage this change today? It just gives you that feeling of people not being on board, and I'm going to have resistance. And this is, I have to think of how I'm going to push these changes through. Or should we really be switching from having effective strategies on how we can lead change? That sounds even a lot better as something to show up for.
Absolutely. Managing feels more like deflecting or keeping a lot of balls in the air versus leading. Really, for me, I interpret that as inspiring change, motivating people, and we want to all do more of that and less managing. So Arianna, I'm sure there are listeners right now thinking, hey, I want to improve in this area, or maybe my firm really needs to make progress in this area. What are some recommendations for next steps you have once someone hangs up on this podcast? What would you advise they do next?
I think one of the first things is to really give thought to what are the changes that are happening within your organization, and to start to put together more of a strategy around change instead of just having it happen in a lot of different areas across the organization. So really wrapping your arms around what are the different changes that we have happening, what's the timeline, who's involved, and to start to put together, to have that visibility, and also to be thinking ahead. Okay, so over the next year, what are the changes? And in some cases that may be too overwhelming. So think about over the next 6 months, what are the changes that we have coming around the corner? And that can put you in a change leadership mindset as a first place to start, because now you can have more visibility on how can I start to align resources. Oh my goodness, so-and-so is working on 3 different projects in 3 different areas led by 3 different people. And you can start to bring alignment well, first, just understanding on what's changing, and then start to bring some alignment into how those things will be done. And then really focusing on, okay, how are we going to address the human side of change? And you can, even if you've started a change, you can still kind of pause and dig into that human element of change and say, okay, I know we've already started on this project, but I really want to make sure that everyone understands the why of why we're doing this. And remember, you need to focus on the why for them first. This is how it's ultimately going to be beneficial for you, because we're all tuned into what's in it for me first. And then here's what it's going to mean longer term for the organization. Here's how I see you playing a role in it. Here's how it's going to happen. Again, really leading in how we're doing it. So those are the first 2 things I would recommend, is really take stock of what are the change initiatives that are happening within your organization, within your firm right now. Get clarity around that. See where you're going to get ahas by going through that process and figuring out places where you can start to create your change leadership strategy, and then focus on the human element of change.
Excellent advice, Arianna. And as always, thank you so much for being on the Boomer Briefing podcast. Sure to appreciate it. And it's always a joy speaking with you. For those listeners here, if you like this topic and you kind of like what we're talking about here, we change topics every week, right? This week, it may be more process focused or leadership focused. Next week, it may be more technology or growth. So please subscribe to the podcast. We release new episodes every Tuesday morning. So please stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks so much. And thanks, Arianna.
Thank you.